On the morning of April 8, 1853, London's most prestigious medical journal prepared its next issue. The court circular had just announced the safe delivery of Queen Victoria's 8th child, Prince Leopold. The list of attending physicians was published, including a name that caught attention, Dr. John Snow. But the bulletin said nothing about what Dr. Snow had done. At the editorial offices of the Lancet, whispers circulated. Had the Queen really used chloroform? Impossible. Within days, the journal would declare it emphatically. The rumour was false. The Queen's physicians do not sanction the use of chloroform in natural labour. The whole thing was mere rumour. Meanwhile, in a modest townhouse on Sackville Street, John Snow carefully recorded his case notes. At 20 minutes past 12, I commenced to give a little chloroform with each pain. He noted the dosage, 15 minims on a folded handkerchief. He recorded the Queen's relief, the successful birth at 1:13 p.m, her cheerful gratitude afterward. Snow knew what had happened, and he knew why the medical establishment was so desperate to deny it. This is the story of Queen Victoria's use of chloroform, and how the medical establishment simultaneously condemned it, covered it up, exploited it, and ultimately couldn't control it. The question everyone thinks they know the answer to is, did religious opposition prevent women from getting pain relief in childbirth? But that's not the real question. The real question is darker and more complex. Why did doctors, not priests, mount the fiercest resistance to obstetric anaesthesia? And why, when the Queen of England herself used it, did they try to hide that fact? To understand what doctors really thought of Victoria's chloroform, we need to understand the power they held over women's bodies and how desperately they wanted to keep it. Victoria was 33 years old when she finally got what she'd been asking for, but the asking had started 5 years earlier. Born May 24, 1819 at Kensington Palace, Alexandrina Victoria had become Queen at 18. By 21, she'd married her cousin Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and then the pregnancies began. 9 children in 17 years. Sighs. She hated pregnancy. She wrote that being pregnant made her feel like a dog or a cow. She suffered what we'd now recognize as postpartum depression after several births. And the births themselves? 7 times between 1840 and 1850, Victoria endured labour without any relief whatsoever. The technology existed. In November 1847, Dr. James Young Simpson of Edinburgh had discovered chloroform's anaesthetic properties and immediately began using it in obstetrics. By early 1848, the news had spread. Victoria heard about it, and in 1848, pregnant with her 6th child, Princess Louise, she asked her physician, Sir James Clark, if she could use it. He said no, too dangerous, he told her. A 15-year-old girl named Hannah Green had died under chloroform just months earlier. The risks were unknown. Better to endure the natural pain. So Victoria did. She endured Louise's birth in March 1848 without anaesthesia. Then Arthur's birth in May 1850. 2 more agonizing labours. 2 more times she could have had relief, but was denied it. What changed in 1853 wasn't the science. It was who made the decision. Prince Albert, a long-standing champion of the sciences, had been watching the debate over chloroform. He'd discussed it with doctors, and when Victoria became pregnant again in 1852, he took action. In early April 1853, he summoned John Snow to Buckingham Palace for an interview. 4 days later, when Victoria went into labour, Snow received an urgent message from Sir James Clark. Go to the palace. This time, Victoria would get what she'd asked for 5 years earlier. Not because the doctors had changed their minds, but because a man with more power than the doctors had decided to override them. The fiercest opposition to chloroform in childbirth didn't come from pulpits, it came from doctors. The Lancet, Britain's leading medical journal, represented the conservative medical establishment, and they were adamantly opposed. Their position was clear: chloroform in natural labour was unnecessary and dangerous. When rumours spread about Victoria's use of it, they published an editorial insisting it was false. The Queen's obstetric physicians, to whose ability the safety of our illustrious Queen is confided, do not sanction the use of chloroform in natural labour. They were lying, or rather, they were trying to make reality match their beliefs by sheer force of denial. But why such fierce resistance? The death of Hannah Green was real. Chloroform could be deadly if administered improperly. But the medical opposition went beyond safety concerns. It was philosophical. Dr. Charles Meigs, a prominent American obstetrician, articulated the prevailing view. Pain in childbirth had moral influence on women. It was a necessary accompaniment to bringing life into the world. To remove the pain would be to interfere with nature's design. Reading between those lines, doctors believed women were supposed to suffer, and they believed they, not women, should decide whether that suffering was necessary. Sir James Clark embodied this paternalism perfectly. Despite Victoria asking for chloroform in 1848, he advised against it. 5 years passed before he allowed it, and even then, only after Prince Albert intervened. When the Medical Gazette later confirmed Victoria had used chloroform, Clark's initial instinct was to deny it publicly. He wanted to protect his professional reputation from the scandal of having permitted something the establishment condemned. The medical establishment's position revealed something crucial. This wasn't about women's safety. It was about maintaining control over medical practice and, more fundamentally, over women's bodies. If the Queen herself could demand and receive pain relief, what would stop ordinary women from demanding it too? Everyone knows the story. Doctors wanted to use chloroform, but the Church condemned it as interfering with God's will. Genesis 3:16 declared women would bring forth children in pain, and ministers thundered from pulpits that to alleviate that pain was sinful. Except that's not quite what happened. Dr. James Young Simpson anticipated religious opposition. Before it even materialized, he wrote an elaborate theological pamphlet in December 1847 defending chloroform. He argued that the Hebrew word translated as pain actually meant labor or toil, not physical suffering. He pointed to Genesis 2:21, where God put Adam in a deep sleep before taking his rib, biblical precedent for anesthesia. Simpson's theological arguments were clever, but here's what's fascinating. In his private letters, written at the same time, Simpson admitted that all religious objection to chloroform has entirely ceased among us, except an occasional remark from some caustic old maid whose prospects of using chloroform are forever past. Yet in his public letters, he wrote dramatically about hideous prejudices, long prayers and sermons against it. Modern historians have noticed this contradiction. A 2013 study concluded that Simpson exaggerated the strength of religious objections as a marketing strategy. He created a David versus Goliath narrative, heroic doctor against oppressive church, because controversy generates publicity. And it worked brilliantly. Did some ministers preach against chloroform? Probably, but documented evidence is scarce. The Archbishop of Canterbury never condemned it. In fact, his own daughter used obstetric anaesthesia the year after Victoria did. Church of England leaders remained largely silent on the issue. The myth of fierce religious opposition persists because it's a better story than the truth. The truth is more complicated. One brilliant self-promoter may have manufactured a controversy to advance both chloroform and his own fame. And in doing so, he gave medical historians a narrative that would endure for over a century, even though the actual resistance came from his fellow doctors, not from priests. When Queen Victoria used chloroform on April 7, 1853, something extraordinary happened next. Almost nothing. The court circular mentioned Dr. Snow among the physicians present. It said nothing about what he'd done. The Lancet declared the whole thing a rumour. The medical establishment closed ranks in silence. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate gatekeeping. Consider the timeline. Snow administered chloroform on April 7th. The court circular on April 8th mentioned him, but not the chloroform. The Lancet published its denial in May. The truth only emerged months later when the Association Medical Journal published a confirmation, likely leaked by Simpson through Sir James Clark. Even then, the story didn't spread widely. The Times didn't mention Victoria's use of chloroform until 1869, 16 years later, in John Snow's obituary. Why the silence? One source puts it plainly. Though one could not openly disapprove of the choices made by the Queen, it seems to have been tacitly understood that such activities should not be promoted to the masses. There it is. The medical establishment had developed a two-tier system. Chloroform was acceptable for wealthy elite women who could afford skilled anaesthetists like Snow. But promoting it to the general public, that would democratise pain relief. That would give ordinary women the power to demand what the Queen had received. And that terrified doctors who'd built careers on the philosophy that women's suffering in childbirth was natural and necessary. The irony cuts deep. Victoria herself felt no such ambivalence. In a letter written in 1859, she described chloroform as the inestimable blessing of chloroform, which no one can ever be sufficiently grateful for. This wasn't polite praise. This was the testimony of a woman who knew the difference, who'd suffered through 7 births without anaesthesia before finally experiencing 2 with it. But Victoria's enthusiasm wasn't publicised. Her suffering wasn't publicised. What was carefully managed was the appearance of royal approval, without the democratisation of access. The conspiracy of silence reveals something darker than simple medical conservatism. It shows how institutional medicine in the Victorian era maintained power, by controlling information, by controlling access to treatment, and ultimately by controlling the narrative about women's bodies and what they deserved. John Snow knew what he'd done. Victoria knew what relief she'd received. But the establishment was determined that ordinary women wouldn't know, or at least wouldn't be encouraged to ask for the same. April 7th, 1853 began early for Queen Victoria. She'd experienced slight pains since Sunday, but by Wednesday morning, labour was unmistakable. At 9 o'clock, Dr. Locock was sent for. An hour later, Sir James Clark sent an urgent note to John Snow: go to the palace. Snow arrived to find Victoria in active labour. In his case notes, he recorded the scene with clinical precision. At 20 minutes past 12 by a clock in the Queen's apartment, I commenced to give a little chloroform with each pain. His technique was careful, measured. He poured about 15 minims, roughly 0.9 millilitres, onto a folded handkerchief. He held it near Victoria's face during contractions, allowing her to inhale the vapours. This was Snow's signature approach: light chloroform, keeping the patient partially conscious rather than fully unconscious. Victoria responded immediately. Snow noted, Her Majesty expressed great relief from the application, the pains being trifling during the uterine contractions. For 53 minutes, Snow continued the administration, and then, at 13 minutes past 1, Prince Leopold was born. Snow's final note captured Victoria's state. The Queen appeared very cheerful and well, expressing herself much gratified with the effect of the chloroform. In that room, at that moment, something revolutionary had occurred. The Queen of England, defender of the faith, ruler of the British Empire, had used a controversial anaesthetic that much of the medical establishment condemned. She'd done it against years of medical advice, and it had worked. But when the news went public, the revolution went silent. The court circular listed the attending physicians: Dr. Locock, Sir James Clark, Dr. Ferguson, and Dr. Snow. It mentioned nothing unusual, just a successful royal birth. Behind closed doors, panic set in among some medical circles. Had the Queen really used chloroform? If word spread, women across Britain would demand it. The careful control doctors maintained over obstetric practice would crumble. The Lancet moved quickly. Their May editorial was emphatic. This was mere rumour. The idea that the Queen's physicians would sanction the use of chloroform in natural labour was absurd. They hadn't. Therefore, it hadn't happened. Sir James Clark, when questioned, reportedly confirmed the Queen had not been exposed to chloroform, but the truth was already leaking. Simpson, who'd pioneered chloroform in obstetrics and probably saw Victoria's use as vindication, made sure the Association Medical Journal learned what had happened. Months after the birth, they published confirmation. The establishment's response? Continued silence. No celebration of this medical milestone, no acknowledgement that perhaps their opposition had been wrong, just quiet, grinding resistance to the idea that women might routinely receive pain relief in childbirth. Victoria herself seemed unaware of the controversy her choice had sparked, or perhaps she simply didn't care. 4 years later, when she gave birth to her 9th child, Princess Beatrice, she used chloroform again. By then, Prince Albert had become so comfortable with the process that he personally administered small amounts before Snow arrived. The Queen had made her choice. She'd found relief from suffering she'd endured 7 times before, and she would use that relief again, regardless of what doctors whispered in their journals. But it would be decades before ordinary women could routinely make the same choice. Not because the technology didn't exist, not because it wasn't safe in skilled hands, but because doctors weren't ready to give up control. So what did doctors think of Victoria's chloroform? The answer splinters into at least 7 distinct positions. The conservative establishment, the Lancet establishment physicians, they thought it was dangerous, unnecessary, and philosophically wrong. Pain in childbirth was natural. Interfering with it risked unknown complications. More fundamentally, they feared losing control over obstetric practice. If women could demand anesthesia, what other aspects of their medical care might they want to control? Their solution was denial and suppression. The reformers, Snow, Simpson, Prothero Smith, they thought chloroform was an inestimable blessing. Victoria's own words, but these doctors shared the sentiment. They'd seen women suffer needlessly and believed medicine existed to alleviate suffering. Snow developed his light chloroform technique specifically to maximize safety. Simpson had performed over 50 procedures in his first month alone. For them, Victoria's use was vindication, though they wished it had been publicised more widely. The cautious professionals, Sir James Clark, they occupied uncomfortable middle ground. Clark had genuine safety concerns. Hannah Green's death was real, but he also had institutional pressures and his own reputation to protect. He advised against chloroform for 5 years, finally relented when Albert intervened, then initially denied it had happened. His position reveals how professional anxieties could override both patient autonomy and evidence. The paternalists, Charles Meggs, Francis Ramsbottom, these physicians, especially prominent in America, thought pain had moral influence on women and served a purpose in bonding mother to child. Removing it would somehow diminish the maternal experience. This position barely disguised a deeper conviction that women's suffering wasn't something to be eliminated but managed by male medical authority. The moralists, some church figures, though fewer than myth suggests. A handful thought using chloroform violated God's decree in Genesis 3:16, but documentation is scarce. More ministers stayed silent or supported it than opposed it. The Archbishop of Canterbury's daughter used obstetric anaesthesia the year after Victoria. The fierce religious opposition was more myth than reality, partly because Simpson manufactured it as marketing. Prince Albert, the invisible architect. He thought the sciences should serve humanity and that his wife's suffering was preventable and therefore unacceptable. His championship of the sciences translated into action, summoning Snow, overriding Clark's hesitation, even personally administering chloroform at Beatrice's birth. His role reveals that sometimes change requires someone willing to use institutional power to override institutional resistance. The women themselves. This is perhaps the most important perspective. Victoria called it that blessed chloroform and the inestimable blessing of chloroform which no one can ever be sufficiently grateful for. These weren't idle compliments. She'd endured 7 births without it. She knew exactly what relief it provided. Other women, especially the younger wives of respectable classes, as one source noted, began asking for it. By the early 1900s, feminist movements would demand pain relief as a woman's right. The women who'd actually experienced childbirth thought the debate was absurd. Of course they wanted relief from pain. The question was why anyone thought they shouldn't have it. What did doctors really think of Queen Victoria's chloroform? They thought it threatened their control, challenged their philosophy, and forced them to confront an uncomfortable question. If medicine could safely eliminate suffering, what justified forcing women to endure it? Some answered that question by becoming reformers. Others answered it by denial, by gatekeeping, by constructing elaborate justifications for maintaining the status quo. But Victoria, and eventually the women who followed her example, answered it differently. They said, "We don't want to suffer unnecessarily. We don't care about your theories of moral influence or natural pain. We want relief, and we're going to demand it." The revolution Victoria began in 1853 wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. The immediate impact of Victoria's chloroform use was complicated. Academic studies have shown that, contrary to popular myth, there was no dramatic breakthrough in 1853. Obstetric anaesthesia didn't become routine overnight. Change came gradually over decades. But something did shift. Snow's practice grew. His use of light chloroform in childbirth soon became a well-known fact, especially with the younger wives of the respectable classes. Women who could afford private physicians began requesting it. The technology and techniques spread, even as establishment journals continued their skepticism. Simpson, the self-promoting pioneer, made sure Victoria's example was cited in his advocacy. Whether he exaggerated the religious opposition or not, he successfully positioned chloroform as modern, progressive, and royally approved. The real changes came later. By the early 1900s, first-wave feminists demanded pain relief in childbirth as a woman's right, part of broader arguments about bodily autonomy and medical choice. They referenced Victoria's example, now decades old but finally becoming common knowledge. Ironically, John Snow never received public recognition for his role during his lifetime. The Lancet, which had been so wrong about both his chloroform use and his cholera theory, gave him a 2-sentence obituary in 1858 that didn't even mention his epidemiological work. The Times finally acknowledged his administration of chloroform to Victoria in 1869 in his obituary, 11 years after his death. This story isn't just about childbirth or anesthesia, it's about how medical progress happens, or rather, how it's resisted. The pattern is familiar. Establishment institutions protecting their authority and philosophy against innovation. Innovators who are sometimes heroes and sometimes self-promoters, or both simultaneously. Women demanding control over their own bodies and being told by male authorities that they don't understand what's good for them. And change that comes not from sudden enlightenment, but from slow, grinding pressure against institutional resistance. Victoria's story reveals that progress often requires multiple elements: scientific innovation, Snow's technique, brave advocacy, Simpson's promotion, however self-interested, institutional power willing to override institutional conservatism, Albert's intervention, and, ultimately, people who benefit from change demanding it for themselves, women insisting on their right to pain relief. None of these alone would have been sufficient. Together, they eventually transformed obstetric practice. On that April morning in 1853, when the Lancet prepared to deny what had happened, they were fighting the future. They didn't know it yet, but they'd already lost. Not because Victoria used chloroform, though she did. Not because science proved it safe, though careful practitioners like Snow made it so. They lost because you can't indefinitely maintain control over people's bodies by denying them relief from suffering, especially once they know relief is possible. Victoria had lived both sides of this divide. 7 births in agony, 2 with relief. She knew the difference. In her own words, the inestimable blessing of chloroform which no one can ever be sufficiently grateful for. That gratitude wasn't just about one drug or one royal birth. It was about the simple, revolutionary idea that women deserved to choose whether to suffer. The doctors didn't want you to know that the Queen had used chloroform. They tried to hide it, deny it, suppress it. But Victoria made sure you'd know. She called it blessed. She called it inestimable. She made her choice visible. And eventually, that made all the difference.